Hey guys, today we are going to read a short story called Marigolds by Eugenia W. Collier. And I think you will find that as we continue to move forward in this unit, we're moving into fiction, we're moving into short story, we're moving into, we're going to read a play. I think you will find that all of these are linked thematically. Next week, we will be watching portions of The Help, and you will be comparing and contrasting these two. So you do need to pay attention. You need to have a pen, pencil out. This is yours to keep. You need to annotate it. I will talk with you as we go through this. However, you need to make sure that you're taking notes, okay? When I think of the hometown of my youth, all that I seem to remember is dust. The brown, crumbly dust of late summer. Arid, sterile dust that gets into the eyes and makes them water, gets into the throat and between the toes of bare brown feet. I don't know why I should only remember the dust. Surely there must have been lush green lawns and paved streets under leafy shade trees somewhere in town. But memory is an abstract painting. It does not present things that as they are, but rather as they feel. And so when I think of the time and the place, I remember only the dry September of the dirt roads and the grassless yards of the shanty town where I lived. And one other thing I remember, another incongruency of the memory, a brilliant splash of sunny yellow against the dust, Miss Lottie's marigolds. Okay, so I want you to pay attention because over the next three paragraphs she describes the setting. All she remembers is dust, and she references a shanty town. Most of y'all have heard about shantytowns in your history classes. However, it's a deprived area on outskirts of town. So based off of this description, we can already infer that this young lady and her family did not have much money. Whenever the memory of those marigolds flashes across my mind, a strange nostalgia comes with it and remains long after the picture has faded. I feel again the chaotic emotions of adolescence, elusive as smoke, yet as real as the potted geranium before me now. Joy and rage and wild animal gladness and shame become tangled together in the multicolored skein of a 14 going on 15. As I recall that devastating moment when I was suddenly more woman than child. Okay, so the kind of theme, loss of innocence, runs through this story. Years ago in Miss Lottie's yard, I think of those marigolds at the strangest times. I remember them vividly now, as I desperately pass away the time. I suppose the futile waiting was the sorrowful background music of our impoverished little community when I was young. The depression that gripped the nation was no new thing for us. The black workers of rural Maryland had always been depressed. I don't know what it was that we were waiting for. Certainly not for the prosperity that was just around the corner, for those were white folks' words which we never believed. Nor did we wait for the hard work and thrift to pay off in the shining success as the American dream promised. For we knew better than to do that. Perhaps we waited for a miracle, amorphous in concept but necessary if one were to have the grit to rise before dawn each day and labor in the white man's vineyard until after dark, or to wander about the September dust offering one sweat in return for some meager share of bread. But God was chary with miracles in those days, and so we waited and waited. Okay, so we know this story takes place in Maryland during the Great Depression. She is African American, and they keep saying, hey, the American dream will pay off as promised. We've had multiple discussions about the American dream and how for some it never does come true, and she is saying they were one of them. We children, of course, were only vaguely aware of the extent of our poverty. Having no radios, few newspapers, and no magazines, we were somewhat unaware of the world outside our community. Nowadays, we'd be called culturally deprived, and people would write books and hold conferences about us. In those days, everybody we knew was just as hungry and ill-clad as we were. Listen to the metaphor. Poverty was the cage in which we were all trapped, and our hatred of it was still the vague, undirected restlessness of the zoo-bred flamingo, who knows that nature created him to fly free. Okay, guys, this whole story is an extended metaphor, and I want you to think about that as we continue to read this. As I think of those days, I feel most poignantly the tag end of summer, the bright, dry times when we began to have a sense of shortened days and the imminence of cold. By the time I was 14, my brother Joey and I were the only children left at our house. The older ones having left home for early marriages or the lure of the city, and the two babies having been sent to relatives who might care for them better than we. Joey was 3 years younger than I, and a boy, and therefore vastly inferior. Each morning our mother and father trudged warily down the dirt road and around the bend, so she to her domestic job, he to his daily unsuccessful quest for work. After our few chores around the tumble-down shanty, Joey and I were free to run wild in the sun with other children similarly situated. For the most part, those days are ill-defined in my memory, running together and combining like a fresh watercolor painting left out in the rain. I remember squatting in the road, drawing a picture in the dust, a picture which Joey gleefully erased with one sweep of his dirty foot. I remember fishing for the minnows in the muddy creek and watching sadly as they eluded my cupped hands while Joey laughed uproariously. And I remember the year, a strange restlessness of body and of spirit, a feeling that something old and familiar was ending, and something unknown and therefore terrifying was beginning. One day returns to me with special clarity. For some reason, perhaps because it was the beginning of the experience, that in some explicable way marked the end of innocence. Okay, again, a reference to end of innocence. There's that defining moment in most of our lives where we realize we are more adult than child, and this was it for her. I was loafing under the great oak tree in our yard, deep in some reverie which I have now forgotten, except that it involved some secret thoughts of one of the Harris boys across the yard. Joey and a bunch of kids were bored now, and the old tire suspended from the oak limb, which had kept them entertained for a while. "Hey, Lisbeth," Joey yelled. He never talked when he could yell. "Hey, Lisbeth, let's go somewhere." I came reluctantly from my private world. "Where do you want to go? What do you want to do?" The truth was that we were becoming tired of the formlessness of our summer days, the idleness whose prospect had seemed so beautiful during the busy days of spring now had degenerated to an almost desperate effort to fill up the empty midday hours. "Let's go see if we can find some locusts on the hill," someone suggested. Joey was scornful. "Ain't no more locusts there. Y'all get 'em all while they're still green." The argument that followed was brief and not really worth the effort. Hunting locust trees wasn't fun anymore by now. "Tell you what," said Joey finally. His eyes sparkled. "Let's go over to Miss Lottie's." The idea caught on at once, for annoying Miss Lottie was always fun. I was still child enough to scamper along with the group over the rickety fences and through bushes that tore our already ragged clothes back to where Miss Lottie lived. I think now that we must have made a trigomatic spectacle, 5 or 6 kids of different ages, each of us clad in only one garment, the girls in faded dresses that were too long or too short, the boys in patchy pants, their sweaty brown chests gleaming in the hot sun. A little cloud of dust followed our thin legs and bare feet as we tramped over the barren land. When Miss Lottie's house came into view, we stopped ostensibly to plan our strategy, but actually to reinforce our courage. Miss Lottie's house was the most ramshackled of all of our ramshackled homes. Okay, so hers is the house that is the worst off. The sun and rain had long since faded its rickety frame, siding from white to a sullen gray. The boards themselves seemed to remain upright, not from being nailed together, but rather from leaning together like a house that a child might have constructed from cards. A brisk wind might have blown it down, and the fact that it was still standing implied a kind of enchantment that was stronger than the elements. There it stood, and as far as I know is standing yet, a gray, rotting thing, with no porch, no shutters, no steps, settled on a cramped lot, with no grass, not any weeds, a monument of decay. In front of the house, in a squeaky rocking chair, sat Miss Lottie's son, John Burke, completing the impression of decay. John Burke was what was known as queer-headed. Black and ageless, He sat rocking day in and day out in a mindless stupor, lulled by the monotonous squeaky squeak of the chair. Okay, guys, so he's mentally challenged. Okay. A battered hat atop his shaggy head shaded him from the sun. Usually, John Burke was totally unaware of everything outside his quiet dream world. But if you disturbed him, if you intruded upon his fantasies, he would become enraged, strike at you, and curse at you in some strange enchanted language, which only he could understand. We children made a game of thinking of ways to disturb John Burke and then to elude his violent retribution. But our real fun and our real fear lay in Miss Lottie herself. Miss Lottie seemed to be at least 100 years old. Her big frame still held traces of a tall, powerful woman she must have been in her youth. Although it was now bent and drawn, her smooth skin was a dark reddish brown, and her face had Indian-like features and the stern stoicism that one associates with Indian faces. Miss Lottie didn't like intruders either, especially children. She never left her yard and nobody ever visited her. We never knew how she managed those necessities which deepened on human interaction, how she ate, for example, or even when she ate. When we were tiny children, we thought Miss Lottie was a witch, and we made up tales that we half believed ourselves about her exploits. We were far too sophisticated now, of course, to believe that witch nonsense, but old fears have a way of clinging like cobwebs. And so when we sighted the tumble-down shack, we had to stop to reinforce our nerves. "Look, there she is," I whispered, forgetting that Miss Lottie could not possibly have heard me from the distance. "Look, she's full with those crazy flowers." "Yeah, look at her." Miss Lottie's marigolds were perhaps the strangest part of the picture. Okay, so think about how this kind of like juxtaposes how this is a sharp contrast of what her home is like. Okay, so her house is the most ramshackle of ramshackle. She has no porch. This house is falling down, but yet she has these flowers, which are a beautiful contrast. It shows something that she deeply cares about. Miss Lottie's marigolds were perhaps the strangest part of the picture. Certainly they did not fit in with the crumbling decay of the rest of her yard. Beyond the dusty brown yard, in front of the sorry gray house, rose suddenly and shockingly a dazzling strip of bright blossoms, clumped together in enormous mounds, warm and passionate and sun-golden. Okay, I want you to listen to all the adjectives, all the verbs, everything that is describing what the flowers look like compared to what the house looks like. The old black witch woman worked on them all summer, every summer, down on her creaky knees, weeding and cultivating and arranging while the house crumbled and John Burke rocked. For some perverse reason, we children hated those marigolds. Okay, why would they hate those marigolds? Okay, marigolds, they're an example of beauty in what kind of a community? Okay, in a shantytown community. They're the one example of beauty. Why would they hate that? They interfered with the perfect ugliness of the place. They were too beautiful. They said too much that we could not understand. They did not make sense. There was something in the vigor with which the old woman destroyed the weeds that intimidated us. It should have been a comical sight, the old woman with a man's hat on her cropped white head, leaning over the bright mounds, her big backside in the air. But it wasn't comical. It was something we could not name. We had to annoy her by whizzing a pebble into her flowers or by yelling a dirty word, then dancing away from her rage, reveling in our youth and mocking her age. Actually, I think it was the flowers we wanted to destroy, but nobody had the nerve to try it. Not even Joey, who is usually fool enough to try anything. "Y'all get some stones," commanded Joey, now, and was met with the instant giggling obedience as everybody except me began to gather pebbles from the dusty ground. "Come on, Elizabeth." I just stood there, peering through the bushes, torn between wanting to join the fun and feeling that it was all a bit silly. "You scared, Elizabeth?" I cursed and spat on the ground, my favorite gesture of phony bravado. "Y'all children get the stones. I'll show you how to use them." I said before that we were children, were not consciously aware of how thick were the bars of our cage. I wonder now, though, whether we were not more aware of it than I thought. Perhaps we had some dim notion of what we were, and how little chance we had of being anything else. Okay, I want you to think, what are these cages? What are these bars? Otherwise, why would we have been so preoccupied with destruction? Anyway, the pebbles were collected quickly, and everybody looked at me and began to run. Okay, so do these flowers symbolize something that they will never have, something that they will never achieve? Are they, as she said, do they have little chance of being anything else, and do these flowers represent that? Come on, y'all. We crept to the edge of the bushes that bordered the narrow road in front of Miss Lottie's place. She was working placidly, kneeling over the flowers, her dark hand plunging into the golden mound. Suddenly, zing! An expertly aimed stone cut the head of one of her blossoms. Who out there? Miss Lottie's backside came down, and her head came up as her sharp eyes searched the bushes. You better get! We had crouched down, out of sight, in the bushes, where we stifled the giggles that insisted on coming. Miss Lottie gazed warily across the road for a moment, then cautiously returned to her weeding. Zing! Joey sent a pebble into the blooms, and another marigold was beheaded. Miss Lottie was enraged now. She began struggling to her feet, leaning on a rickety cane and shouting, Y'all go home! And the rest of the kids let loose with their pebbles, storming the flowers and laughing wildly and senselessly at Miss Lottie's impotent rage. She shook her stick at us and started shakily toward the road, crying, Get along! John Burke! John Burke! Come help!